We'll get started. First of all, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Mike Harris of FCC Consulting, and I'll be chairing this panel this afternoon in our webinar. Thank you for joining us. And thank you as well to Neotas, who are the sponsors of this webinar and supporting it. So we very much appreciate that. And we obviously hope that you'll all find it interesting and helpful. So let's make a start on the topic. Many conferences and webinars have focused on the subject of technology in AML, and whilst that's obviously a very important subject, and there's an awful lot spoken about it, tech solutions are only as good as the data that power them. So we felt that this webinar, it would be good to really talk about how we see data evolving as a topic, as a tool, and how we can, as we said in the title of the webinar, how we can crack the financial crime code and power up with cutting-edge data. So I'm hoping that during the course of this discussion, we'll talk about some of the ways that firms are beginning to use other sources of data to tackle the burgeoning financial crime problem. And we all believe that data is the key to solving many problems in life. I was trained in engineering, and my background in engineering depended on having accurate data. And many of life's problems in medicine, biotechnology, healthcare, and pharmaceuticals are being solved with data. So even consumer marketing depends on good data. Yet I'm not sure in solving the huge financial crime problem, which actually is measured on a global basis in trillions of dollars, that we're yet really harnessing the power of data. So in this webinar, we're going to explore some of the challenges as well as the opportunities and how we can better harness the power of data in mitigating financial crime risk. So I'm pleased to say that I'm joined by a panel of experts whose roles in various ways each bring a different perspective and experience on this particular topic. So I'm hoping that the cumulative impact of all this, we will actually uncover some of the ways that we can think about tackling financial crime, perhaps using data in new ways for the first time. So I'm going to start by asking each of the panelists just to give a short introduction about themselves, what they do, a little bit about background and experience. And I'll start because you appear left to right on my screen with Linda, if I may.
Hi everyone, my name is Linda Baskett. I am currently the Global Head of Financial Crime for Computershare. I have 23 nearly years experience in the financial crime space. The first few of those were in intelligence and law enforcement, and then I moved over to the private sector. So I have some experience of implementing new due diligence systems and lots of bits and bobs of working with data.
Thank you, Linda. I'm sure we shall benefit from that as we go on. And I'll turn next to Sam, who appears next in my on my screen.
Hi, yeah, I'm Sam. So I'm Head of Research and Development at Neotas. My role is basically to be constantly looking for new data sources that we can find, mainly through open source intelligence, bring them, how we can bring them into our processes and how we can kind of format and sift through that data in an effective way so that we're not kind of hit with too many false positives, and so that we are using data in an efficient way from lots of different sources.
Great stuff. Thank you, Sam. I'm sure we'll be drawing on that experience and knowledge. And lastly, Tom.
Good afternoon, everyone. Hi, Tom Hammond. Yeah, I have 20 years of experience in financial services in the fin crime world, and now I'm working at PwC, supporting clients with their various fin crime issues and solutions that we can provide them. My experience has been in the data and analytics world, so this is a very interesting topic for me, kind of being in the trenches in some of these organizations and dealing with some of the data that you need to wrestle with to solve some of those financial crime problems. We may go through some of those stories, and I'll try not to get too sentimental about some of them, but yeah, a very interesting topic, and glad to be here today, so thank you.
Great stuff. Thank you, Tom. And I think some of your phraseology there suggests that we all know that dealing with data can be a battle. It can be a challenge. So I'm sure we'll discuss some of those issues as well as we go through, as I said, It's the challenges and the opportunities that data present in helping solve this huge problem of financial crime. Just as a practical level, if anybody who's listening in wants to pose a question, if your screen looks like mine, there's a little button called Live Stage, which if you click on that, it opens up a chat and a Q&A section, and we'll be able to see anything that you post there. So please feel free to post comments, questions, thoughts. It's always good to make this as interactive as we can within the confines of being in a webinar environment. So please do post. We'll either pick them up as we go along, because as I said, the panelists will see them, and if we can answer the question and it's right to there and then, we will. But obviously we'll hopefully leave a bit of time at the end as well. So please do make this interactive, share your thoughts, post some questions as we go along. So let's start, panel, by thinking about where we are now. And I'm thinking here of the data that we have typically used in anti-money laundering compliance, probably for the last 15 to 20 years. I remember when I started in this particular industry sector, even then, data like PEPs and sanctions data, adverse media sources, were all very embryonic. They were just evolving. And yet that's only probably 15 years or so ago. So we've come a long way, but we're still using a lot of those traditional data sources. I also want to talk about, so I'm talking about the data we use in compliance terms, but also from a practitioner's perspective within a financial services organization. There are also huge challenges with the wide range and spectrum of customer data that we have to deal with. So thinking about it from two ways, let's start by just thinking about where we are now. And if you could each give a summary from your perspective that outlines some of the challenges organizations are facing in these areas and how firms are typically managing data. So I'm not sure who would like to start, but again, I'll start left to right on my screen. Linda, would you like to launch in on this?
Okay, thank you. So I think what we've got ourselves into is a bit of a prescriptive situation. So when we're onboarding new customers, we almost have a checklist of information that industry guidance is telling us that we need to get, and then we're reliant on some systems to just give us information about that person, and that information can be correct, it might not be, but I think we've almost boxed ourselves into this position where we're just following what we're supposed to do and not really thinking about the broader picture. I also think there are still challenges in a lot of firms with legacy systems, and a lot of firms grow through acquisition, and you're bringing in bits of information into one part of the business that could be useful in another part of the business, but again, it's all tied up and sort of siloed. So I think I suppose my overall point would be we're quite boxy, like we're either ticking a box or putting information in a box and just leaving it there and not getting that holistic overview.
I couldn't agree more. I think it's really interesting.
Please pick up, Tom, and add your.
I didn't want to jump in there, but I think you're right. There is some real sort of, legacy issues with data, but some of it's about the fact that we don't realize the gold mine that we're sitting on. And I think there is an aspect of this that is kind of realizing that even in the FinCrime compliance space, you are generating data and not just using it. And I think that's sometimes what's missed is the fact that we are kind of pulling together insights and investigations on bad actors, etc. And that is creating data that then can be potentially shared. And we're seeing some of that now across organizations, the ability to start looking at that. But I think the point is that there's kind of a even going through those tick box exercises where we're sort of going, okay, well, there it is, we'll use that later on, not realizing that there's actually some analytics we can overlay, there's some kind of joining the dots in the data that we've got. And that's before you even start looking at like third-party data and external sources. I think there's a real sort of a lack of appreciation for some of that internal data. And I think in the FinCrime space, you're at this sort of the end of the process sometimes, and it means that data has been transformed, used by everybody and their cousins, and by the time you've got it, you're like, which bit is this? Is where did this come from? And is this the same as when the customer inputted at the beginning? So I think that kind of understanding of data quality and lineage and being able to really kind of understand what we've got is a big part of the kind of opportunity that we have to exploit that data.
Thank you, Tom. Yeah, interesting. Sam, anything you want to add to that when you think about, before we get on to the new data sources, you know, you're seeing a lot of traditional data sources still being widely used.
Yeah, I was going to say, I think there's nothing inherently wrong with the traditional data sources. I think it's still good to use them, and like Linda said about having them as a box ticking exercise, but I think people need to have the understanding that they can use that as kind of the basis, but there should be other things that they can also do as well. And I think, yeah, like Tom said, then also understanding where the data's come from and how you can validate that data so that you're not kind of going off in the wrong direction, understanding kind of how useful the data that you are actually using is, where it's come from, and how you know it can be sort of correct, I guess.
Thanks, Sam. Linda, can I come back to you on this topic with your experience in terms of, you know, as a practitioner in actually undertaking the day-to-day processes of a KYC onboarding? What, and you touched on this a little bit, but let's really unpack it in detail. What are the data sources that we typically, any financial institution will typically be relying on at the moment?
So initially we're sort of getting some information directly from the client or the customer.
Yeah.
And then we tend to use sort of the names like Experian, Equifax, to verify that through credit checks. And sort of, you know, has this person been at this address? Have they applied for credit there, etc. And then they also, those two companies and others who I'm sure there's many of them, will often do the PEP thing as well. I've sometimes had some difficulty with one of them, who shall remain nameless, when I actually have challenged, what are you telling me about this PEP? Or when you look it up, the flag actually relates to someone who shared the same name but who died in 1884. And trying to dig beneath the veil of what they've got is quite challenging. But so I think that tends to be like the traditional things. What we're missing is ongoing monitoring, I think, and we'll probably come on to that later. But like, it's a snapshot in time. This person is who they are at that point, and then we're not very good at going back and checking up on that.
Well, I think that raises a really important point, and we will come back to it. But, you know, I think what you've just outlined there is a product of us all developing systems which are focused on primarily regulatory compliance, making sure that we meet the rules. Tom, would you like to develop the theme in more detail about the data sources that we're currently using and depending on?
Yeah, so I think there's a really interesting angle here that Linda raised around kind of verifying that information, and not just solely relying on one source and kind of taking it as read that's, you know, the kind of be all and end all of the data that we require. So I think there's a couple of angles. One is that, you know, the trend generally in society, I'm not going to get too existential on this, but ultimately, you know, there is a kind of a misinformation kind of volcano at the moment when it comes to data that's readily available, you know, in the world. And I think what that teaches us is, you know, you need to verify your sources. You need to be able to match that with, you know, other data that you can then, you know, build a much richer profile and a more accurate profile of the entity that you're considering. And so I think the thing that's really interesting is that, you know, we have these traditional sources and lists, but ultimately what we're now seeing is the requirement to be able to kind of match that and leverage technology that can kind of bring these sources together and be able to then build these richer profiles. And so I think that we're entering into that phase where we've kind of got these traditional sources, but we now want to start using them in different ways and building on that insight that we've used in a kind of one-to-one basis before. We can now kind of, you know, understand the network connections of these different entities and build that richer profile.
Yeah, thanks, Tom. what I'm hearing a little bit is that we have issues around data governance. That's an issue that we can be relying on data that's come from trusted sources, which is obviously important. That data ages, that we have a data at a snapshot at a point in time. Risk doesn't. Risk is dynamic and it continuously changes, and the risk profile of any entity can be dramatically changed in a short space of time. And we've made decisions based on data that we were looking at that point in time when we were doing the onboarding. So clearly there's some limitations there. I'm trying to get out here what are the real challenges with where we are now, in terms of some of the issues that firms face in managing their current data. We're talking here both internal and external. So I've picked up 2 issues. Anything that you would like to add to that before we kind of like move the conversation forward?
Well, I think we touched a bit on kind of quality there, and kind of ensuring that there is processes that we have in place to kind of continually assess the quality of the data that we're leveraging. And I think that part is important. I think we'll talk about regulations and how important it is to be kind of demonstrable in your data quality assessments and everything that you're doing. And that goes to lineage, which I think, Sam, you mentioned earlier on, kind of, that idea of, we want to know the provenance of data. We need to be able to validate that and be able to kind of, talk confidently about where these data sources have come from. And that is part of data governance, but it's also the fact that, that kind of continual assessment of quality is going to be important, and everything under that umbrella.
And we should be doing that anyway, right? Because we now have data protection legislation, which is a bit like the GDPR, but it allows people to. I mean, the worst thing in the world from the ICO's perspective. Sorry, got my acronyms mixed. Is that you have a breach on data that you shouldn't have in the first place.
Yeah.
And I think that, in some cases, I mean, we've discussed this many times before, Mike, but in some cases, data privacy legislation and data protection are our friend, in that we shouldn't be keeping data that's out of date or no longer required. We should be keeping it up to date and accurate. But in some cases, and I think we'll come on to that later, they can sometimes be our foe. So it's a very interesting world when it comes to data.
Yeah, double-edged sword. And maybe with let's just pick up on that, because we touched on regulation. Regulation is driven by the legal environment that we operate in and the restrictions that are imposed on regulated firms in what they can do with data. And you've just touched on one obvious one there, which is data privacy laws, and that tension between the financial crime compliance requirement and data privacy, and there's a real tension in that, but also data sharing. So let's just pick up on that a little bit, because going back to my sort of little simple examples at the beginning, when in the engineering world there were no such regulatory restrictions. We were looking for the best available data for the particular problem that we were solving, and there were no sort of like backdrops or contextual challenges that prevented us from getting our hands on the best data to use to solve that problem. Whereas I think in financial crime compliance, there are regulatory and legal constraints. Should we talk about that a little bit? What are they?
The engineering world sounds much like the criminal underworld, to be honest, because they don't have like any restrictions either. And this is why they can move and evolve and develop so much faster than we can evolve and develop the tools and things to stop them. Because they don't have these restrictions. So basically, if your data is stolen in a data breach, it's out there on the dark web, wherever. Don't care. Anyone can have that for a small fee, and they're not charging astronomical amounts of money. It's like £1 a record, but then they'll have like 100,000 records. But that's where the challenge comes, and I think it's recognised, and I think we are making baby steps. I think there was something in the Economic Crime and Corporate Transparency Act that kind of was starting to allow us to share more data for the purposes of like economic crime prevention. But it's the bit where we all end up, I think, in a bit of a mess with our legal departments. It's trying to get lawyers, corporate lawyers, comfortable that sharing information is not going to be detrimental. And of course, you then have the competition element thrown in, and a lot of times, which then creates even more of a friction between like, why are you sharing this?
Yeah,
I think it's interesting because it has moved on, hasn't it? And you kind of mentioned a couple of things there where, I think we're almost having conversations that I seem to remember having like 10 years ago, where everyone was like, that's not going to happen. Don't even like sharing information from a money laundering perspective between organizations. Just, walk away. Go and do something else. But now it's kind of real, and there's these pilots that are starting to look at that, and we're seeing it kind of internationally, that it's working and it's moving forward. I mean, I do think that, like, from a regulatory perspective, and this might be my optimism talking, some of it is about kind of effort and kind of making sure that you're able to demonstrate that you're doing things in a kind of in a safe way when you're dealing with this data, and sometimes that takes investment, sometimes it takes effort, and I think we've been remiss sometimes in not putting that in the past, and therefore it's just been sort of seen as a barrier to sharing. I do think you're right that it makes it complicated, and that it creates a sort of a barrier to entry, but I think we're starting to see things change, and I think, Linda, your point about being able to keep up with the pace at which data can change in the criminal world is kind of, we don't want that gap to keep growing. And so I think taking these steps is so important. And I do think that kind of, being conscious of those regulations and kind of thinking about the spirit of them is where you need to go with it, because you're right, I wouldn't want my data shared in the wrong way, as none of us would, but I would if it's going to stop some sort of criminal activity happening, if it's done in the right way, etc., etc. And those are the things that I think we kind of need to overcome.
Legitimate use case. Sure. Sam, can I bring you back in on this thought? You're dealing with data every single day. You're familiar with some of these issues. What would you like to add to it?
Yeah, I think my use case for it is a little bit different in terms of I think we don't focus too much on the sharing of data that's already been collected, but we're going out and looking for kind of data through open sources that is readily available, but people just are not necessarily harnessing in the best way. So in that sense, I guess it would be more about kind of making sure that people understand what data is available for them, and how they can bring that in, because it is already out there. It's not necessarily going to cause too much in the way of kind of a GDPR issue, because it's open source and it's available. So as long as you're not like kind of abusing that, then yeah, I think that's something that we would definitely focus a little bit more on, looking at those different data sources.
And I think that's really important. There are ways around it. Like, I'm sitting here sounding like a professor of doom, but there, we can also use anonymized data, especially for, like, definitely internally, in terms of looking for patterns and seeing what's going on. We don't need to use personal data for that. We can find other ways. And the other bit I would add is I've had one situation, and it's only one, so it's not the end of the world, but just a word of caution. I think some of it comes back to risk appetite. So I have had a colleague in a peer firm call me up and say, right, there's this client, we found this about them, you might want to have a look at what you've got. And then when we've done our review, we haven't found the same thing, and we haven't ended up making the same decision. So I think that there is a big bit of that involved in it as well, is we can all share, but kind of comes back to the verification of the source and how reliable you think it can be, and then what you do with it your side. I don't think everyone should be passing names around going, this person is definitely a money launderer, this person's a fraudster, this person's this. I think it's about fact, and passing on fact that somebody can then verify themselves and work out what their risk appetite is. And clearly, if it's criminal, everyone's risk appetite should be zero tolerance, but
Yeah, and that's part of the challenge, isn't it? Because when we enter into anything to do with financial data for suspected financial crime, money laundering, fraud, whatever it is, it's the key word, it's suspected. It's not actual proven fact at that stage. we have, suspicious activity, and hence obviously the whole thing in the reporting regime of suspicious activity reports. It's prefaced with that word, we're not 100% sure. And I think that obviously, as you said, Linda, brings some challenges with it. Let's just briefly, before we move on to talk about opportunities with data, let's talk about data management and the challenge of that. Do you see the importance of data rising in strategic thoughts and boards and in the firms? Tom, you're dealing with a wide range of clients. Is the whole subject of data management sort of got the right level of strategic importance within the firms that you talk to?
So I think so, and I think it is improving. I think that there's an angle on this that is around kind of, I think I raised it at the top of the session, around kind of understanding what you've got and the value of it. And I think that has been proven a few times through now, and that means that there's much more of a case for leveraging it. I think in the past it may have been seen as something that lurks off in the tech building up somewhere where they're dealing with data and all the rest of it, or it was limited to marketing and other things that were exploiting it well. I think now what we're seeing is that there's proven cases of where leveraging data is bringing value. And I think that kind of literacy about understanding what the components of data are when we talk about them is growing, and therefore I've been in front of boards that have been able to talk confidently about critical data elements and things like that, which I don't think you would have seen a few years back. So definitely I think there's a swell of understanding and interest that I think is driving change. Yeah,
absolutely. Linda?
I think I am. I'm seeing a lot more, of the words being used. What worries me is we'd like to do a little buzzword game every so often in financial services, and something becomes the big thing, like ESG for a while. At some point it was financial crime. But I think it's actually people then delivering on what they want to do, and do they understand what they want to do with this data and analytics, I think is what we need to think about. The other thing I would add is we probably are, as Tom said, we're probably already doing this to a certain extent from marketing perspectives, and like just knowing our customers so we can know what else we can offer them in terms of products and services. We should be aligning up with that. We shouldn't be doing a whole separate data and analytics thing. It should all form part of the whole thing. And actually something we might find out through the due diligence and things that we are doing might then inform or assist the marketing people going forward. So I think it's a very collaborative thing, not a separate thing.
Yeah, very, very good point. And I think, we still think in silos within businesses, and compliance is very much in its box still in the mindsets of a lot of organizations. Sam, anything you want to add to this about the prominence of data and the role of of data as a strategic, issue?
No, to be honest, I think these guys have covered it. I think, it's about understanding where it's come from, how you're going to use it. I think we kind of, covered that.
Certainly from my experience, I've seen a growth in the role of the chief data officer over the last few years. That perhaps is indicative of the trend that you've talked about, Tom, that it is gathering greater importance, that we are thinking strategically more about the role of data, not just in financial crime compliance, but across the business.
I think,
I think. Sorry,
I was just going to say, I think the conversation we had at the beginning as well is there is more appetite from the people we speak to of we have this data and we have this data internally and we have this data externally, speaking to technology companies about how can we bring that together. We know there should be a way of bringing that together. That's been one thing that I've seen kind of a bit of an appetite increase for, I'd say, is the understanding of the data you have and then knowing there should be a way to bring it together. So how can we do that, I guess?
Yeah. Thank you. So I think, let's pivot the conversation now. I think we've kind of identified a lot of the challenges in data management and the tools that we've got to deal with that, etc. I think we've highlighted a few of those challenges, and hopefully we put a little bit of optimism in there that they're not, it's not all, as you said, Linda, doom and gloom, that there is some optimism that we're heading the right way in certain areas. But let's pivot the conversation now. And I want to ask this question to you. If the focus was primarily on detecting and preventing financial crime rather than satisfying a regulatory requirement, how might that impact and change our approach to data and data analytics? I want to throw that in there because, you know, it's not just about the data, it's what we do with the data that's important as well. And what we would be needing to focus more on if, you know, we were more concerned with the effectiveness of our systems rather than necessarily the efficiency or the requirement, the regulatory requirements that we have to offer. Might that change our thinking around data sources and so on? So I don't know who wants to kick off with thoughts on that one.
I mean, I'm quite surprised that we've got this far without sort of talking about machine learning and AI and kind of the exploitation of it. But ultimately, you know, if you're talking about prevention, you're talking about, you know, kind of getting in front of this, then you're going to have to think a lot quicker, both in a machine sense and, you know, operationally potentially as well. And that kind of speed requires, you know, you to be assisted by our machine overlords. You know, they're going to be the ones who need to you know, but the understanding that, you know, we need to kind of leverage that technology to be able to move at pace. And, you know, it is fed by data. You know, the kind of machine learning and AI things that we're talking about, be it Gen AI or your more traditional kind of like supervised learning, etc. You know, it requires this data to make it effective. And so I think, you know, you're going to be looking more at leveraging kind of real-time kind of rails and platforms and kind of making sure that you're moving more towards cloud and scalable compute that allows you to move at pace. But understanding that, you know, that data that we're talking about is going to become kind of, you know, cyclical. You need to feed back into the machine as well. So those outputs, the SARs that we're talking about, the exits, etc., you know, we kind of need to define those as inputs into the machines that we're building. So I think that, you know, that's going to be the focus is it's kind of, you know, you need to appreciate the kind of pace at which you need to move and the technology that comes with that.
Yeah, thank you, Tom. Linda?
Yeah, I completely agree. I think real-time alerts is the way to go. That can, though, cause problems operationally because you need to have people there to respond to those alerts. I think open source intelligence or open source information is also like the way to go. But just again, it comes back to that reliability on your sources and knowing who your sources are. So in a previous firm, we put in an open web searching tech piece and just switched it on, and I was, as a practitioner, I was like, this is brilliant. I'm going to look everywhere across the World Wide Web, and I can find whatever I like about these people. Within the first week, I was like, oh, that's not a good idea, because a lot of it isn't actually, I wouldn't rely on it. I wouldn't make a decision based on it. So very, very quickly, we were coming back to scale back to making sure that, you know, what were the sources that we particularly thought we would rely on to make a decision, and could we hone what more, like, you know, put in some keywords and stuff to find more what we really want to find, rather than just drowning in a sea of every mention of said client anywhere.
Yeah, very good point. That's probably a good segue for you as a OSINT expert, Sam, to talk about that, because open source intelligence clearly something that Neotas specializes in. And yet, you know, we all know there are challenges in using open source intelligence practically to make decisions on the, you know, impact onboarding and ongoing monitoring. Sam?
Yeah, I think I spoke about it at the beginning, and Linda, you actually mentioned it as well, is using that open source intelligence, but not to make a binary good or bad decision, but just to inform and enhance the decision that you are making. So you have to make sure that whoever is reviewing that information understands it fully, I guess. And so that means kind of giving context to it, giving the source of it, giving how it was, even kind of to the point of how it was found in the first place. so that people can review it, and then, like you said, depending on their risk appetite, they can make that decision as to whether they want to use that information or not. I think on the previous point as well, the kind of, like Tom said, the legacy system, that we were speaking about legacy systems, and I think one thing that is going to need to happen is just that speeding up, and I think bringing in kind of AI and NLP to help you make those decisions. So Linda, you spoke about kind of running PEPs and sanctions checks and getting an alert for someone with the right name, but just the wrong person, like completely the wrong person. I think the more data you have, the more you can use kind of technology to sift out those false positives. Because if you already have a set of data about a person from questionnaires or from any other kind of place where you found it, then you have a lot of identifiers that you should be able to use to sift through kind of adverse media, PEP, sanctions, anything else, to help you find the things that are most useful to you, so that you spend your time reviewing the things that are, like you said, that have the risks in them, and that are most relevant to your individual or your company or whatever you're looking at, really.
Thanks, Tom. Tom, Sam, thank you. So, Tom, I'll come back to you in a moment on this, because this is an area that you specialize in, the technology part. But let's just talk about what new sources of data that we could be using within our financial crime compliance arena, if our focus was much more on, rooting out financial crime rather than, the present system, which is much more regulatory focused. Sam, you've identified there, obviously, open source, as you did, Linda. What are the sources of new sources of information and data are available to us? I think you hinted at unstructured data and how we can harness and capture that. Sam, anything else?
No, I was just going to say, so unstructured data in lots of forms. There's things that people can use, things like, like social media, like archived information on the internet, that I think can enhance that process. And I think one thing is that we spoke about at the beginning a little bit, but the people who the system is trying to detect now understand the system quite well. So you have to start to look at, if they understand the checks that are going to be in place, how they're going to avoid them. You have to start being a bit creative and looking at. So we talk about things like social media, things like kind of, we even use things like domain registry information, but also kind of news sites in different languages that aren't necessarily getting picked up by kind of big data sets. News sites that are kind of specific to an area or to an industry can really be useful as well.
I think one of the areas as well that is interesting and kind of relevant, given the kind of where things are going, is that obviously there's information related to crypto and blockchain that is, either through the data providers that have worked to kind of infer data from wallets, etc., and be able to build profiles of information. But that in terms of news sources, ultimately, when we talked about dark web, we've talked about criminal kind of typologies, etc., in that way. And I think that there is a requirement for us to kind of delve into some of those sources to be able to put this together. But ultimately, it's about connecting it all, right? And so you're going to need to do that verification. You're going to need to work with those data providers or build that up yourself to be able to then exploit it. But I do think that that's another area that is kind of going to be more and more important.
Thanks, Tom. Linda, any additional thoughts on?
Well, mine would be a less technical response, but I'm finally pleased to see, or I'm pleased to finally see, that gimlets are working effectively. I think, there's a lot of people in private sector who have worked in as either police forces or HMRC, law enforcement or government, but there's a lot of people that haven't, and it's almost about what, let's be honest, 99 maybe percent of our customers are all going to be legitimate customers. We're looking for that really small number that aren't, and that's hard. And actually being now fed information out to have those wins, because I think most of us, our motivation for being in the job is that we actually want to do some good and we want to stop criminal activity, whatever that may look like. And I think those gymnasts, but again, they're very banking focused. They're
Mm.
sort of top tier banks, like, those kind of organizations. There are lots of other organizations who have a wealth of information as well, and I think the NCA need to start drilling out into those as well.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more on that one, Linda. You know, the Gimlet, great concept. I think we were kind of, as a nation, we're very much leading the way in terms of having an infrastructure that enabled the public-private partnership to really delve into actual, crime cases, and in a meaningful way. And I agree with you. I think that whole framework needs to be opened up much more, on a much wider basis, to the wider regulated sectors, because there, I think you used the word earlier, Tom. There's gold in there. There's gold that we haven't been harnessing, and when you look at the effectiveness of our enforcement and catching the bad guys, if you want, the NCA statistic itself tells us that we're not being very successful when less than 1% of the sort of illicit assets in the system are ever actually recovered. We must be able to do things better. And I think that's what I'm trying to get at here. How can data analytics with technology really help us to do better? And, come back to the idea of using synthetic data, but I'm thinking here how data can be used to understand criminal typologies better. Quite a lot of work's been done in money mules, and I've seen some of the research that helps firms analyze and understand through transaction monitoring systems, to spot those sorts of typologies. Is there scope to improve that from anything that you've seen in terms of understanding criminal methods and typologies better?
I think we will be using more analytics to start plotting fraudulent activity. We've already started it in some of the regions, one particular region, and we've actually managed to map an organised crime gang activity. And when we then hand that off to law enforcement, they love it because we've done half the job for them. So I think definitely from a fraud perspective, I mean, if you think about the fraud world, and we all know action fraud is going to be revamped, which is a really good thing. But if everybody reported all of the numbers that they got a dodgy text from, then there would be so much data in there. But how is that being analysed? And that's, again, that needs to be a better thing. And then obviously they're taking it to the telecom providers to get it sorted out. But I definitely think the fraud space has got a lot of room for using data to predict things.
Absolutely. When 41% of all crime is fraud related, we've got a serious problem that we've got to get on top of.
Yeah.
Anything you want to add to these thoughts around typologies, Tom?
Yeah, I mean, I was just going to say, again, it's sort of, I reflect on this, historically, and, the kind of the move from very simple rules and, limited typologies that were kind of dished out in a kind of like, these are the main things you need to hit, things that, let's face it, weren't very effective. And, the move towards, where we are now, potentially where it's kind of using our own, whichever firm it is, that kind of understanding of exits and SARs to drive kind of those typologies and understand that these are the things I actually definitely think are suspicious. So maybe I should build my typologies and have that as my input, and that feedback loop is much better. But I think we're also seeing the fact that there is more collaboration now, and we have the kind of, the pilots out there that are about data sharing from an AML perspective between financial institutions. And, I think that's where we'll start to see some of that work flourish. And I do think that it's important because, these typologies, the way that the criminals are interacting with the financial system is going to continually evolve, and therefore we need to be continually feeding that back in, and it's only going to come from collaborating. So I think that collaboration part is absolutely key.
Yeah, absolutely. Sam, I'm going to turn to you now, because as someone who works in a due diligence company at Neotas, and you're doing research, or you personally, but the team, and you lead a lot of that, doing research every day using a wide variety of data sources. And we kind of touched on this in drawing out the types of data sources that you would use. But how would you like to tell us a little bit more about how that's actually used in the work that you do on a day-to-day basis, and how that is actually in new ways, uncovering some of this crime? The way that sanctions evasion is, for example, a hot topic in the industry, because we all know that, sanctions compliance is challenging at the best of times. But, again, the smart criminals evade it easily, and they have all sorts of manner of tactics to evade it. How are you going about this? What processes do you go through to try and uncover these networks and these criminal activities?
Yeah, I think I spoke about it a bit earlier, but the idea that, like you said, Mike, criminals understand what checks are going to be done, so then they think of ways around them. So then trying to get a step ahead of that to try and think a bit more creatively. So, I mean, we spoke about social media earlier, but there's ways of overlaying corporate information, corporate records, directorships, etc., with social media information. So then you start to see that actually these two companies, which we thought would have no connection, you can see that actually directors or whatever are connected online, and actually suddenly this situation we didn't think was too suspicious, there's now some suspicions around it. One key thing I think we've had a lot of success with in terms of the data sources that we're using is finding people who change their names. We find people in, like I spoke earlier, domain registry information and archived data that's on the internet through social media or through kind of other archived bios or anything like that, where people have actually changed their name. They've committed a crime in one country, they've moved countries, they've changed their name, and a lot of the time that can help them get around kind of different checks that are being run, because you put the name into a PEPs and sanctions tool or whatever and nothing comes back. But actually, if you find the name that they were previously using when they committed that offense, then it's going to find you some hits. So getting to that, filling that little gap where you can use this information that is historical, where people have like consistent identifiers across their lifetime, matching that up with the different names that have been used with them, can really help. And we've seen it quite a lot, uncover kind of things that have happened in the past that people have tried to get away from, essentially.
So you're using a lot of open source intelligence, you're using social media, you're visualizing networks, you're using all those sort of software analytics tools to uncover financial crime, and that obviously is making a difference. Feed that back into the let's say the banking world of onboarding customers on a day-to-day basis in large numbers. How could that be industrialized, to use an old engineering term, that would make that easily done at scale?
Yeah, I think well, one thing from a customer point of view, I think, is it takes a long time to find that information, to validate that information. I mean, if you have these different data sources, you can sort of almost pre-populate that information for clients, I guess, and then they can kind of validate whether it's true or not. But you can kind of say, here's what we suspect is your information, not necessarily rating to risk or anything, but just your basic information, so that they don't have to spend so long kind of filling in those kind of questionnaires. It can kind of speed up that process and allow you a little bit more time to focus on the risky areas, a little bit more kind of manpower and technology power to focus on the areas where you think there's going to be an issue, I guess.
So back to the risk-based approach, initial risk assessment, understanding the risks that are in front of you, doing the right things to understand that risk as you're onboarding, which then obviously leads you into, what is the level of due diligence that's appropriate for this entity that I'm bringing into the business, or, managing its ongoing risk profile.
And that's what you want, operationally as well. Like, I want to know who I need to be looking at and who I don't need to be looking at, and spending more time. So I wouldn't necessarily want to be doing like open source intelligence searching on everybody, but I want those triggers to then tell me that I need to look into this one. And that can be sometimes quite difficult, because as Sam was just saying, they'll present and they'll present as legit, but it's that extra bit that kind of changes that risk rating. But I suppose you kind of want something which is just going to flag. I would want something, if that was running all along in the background, I'd want something which just says, these are red, these are amber, these are green.
Yeah.
And go from there.
Yeah.
And I think we're seeing it. We're working with clients now on this very very problem, and working with data providers and tech providers to kind of do that enrichment part, which is that we'll be given information, but ultimately what you want to do is you want to kind of steelman that information by verifying it against other sources, kind of matching that and resolving it into, as Sam said, these kind of networks of connection that ultimately give you that insight into who people are next to and connected to. Because previously we looked things through a single lens, and it was like, what information do we have about this customer? It's very much, and I think I'm not alone in saying this thing, in that it's very rare that individuals are laundering money. It's networks, connected individuals and gangs and criminal syndicates. So by its very nature, you need to understand the interconnected nature of that data for that person with their kind of nodes and connected parties. So I think that it's a critical part of the KYC process is enrichment, and we're starting to see that become much more powerful.
That's an important point. Thank you, Tom, for that. Tom, I'm going to sort of direct this question because it kind of follows on from that. We've also had a question posted from the listeners, which is along the lines of asking if we see any perceptible difference between the way that the fintechs are managing data for fin crime purposes compared with the traditional financial institutions, if you like, the red brick type of organization. And obviously you're doing work across a spectrum of different types of clients. Do you see any differences?
So I think there are differences, and I think with anything there's a kind of spectrum of kind of things that people need to work on and are working on, and I think some of it still comes down to fundamentals, in that we're kind of dealing with data fundamentals of people and the data that they give us and the transactions and the way they interact with the kind of financial ecosystem. But there is potentially more appetite to kind of be machine learning first at the kind of the fintech end of the scale, but it brings with it its own challenges. So at the moment there isn't a kind of like, oh, this is the the flagship way of doing this, because there's a balance depending on the type of clients you have, the kind of the areas of the market that you're targeting, and so it often is that that kind of assessment of risk for that particular institution or kind of company is paramount. But ultimately, I think there is a wind that's blowing it all in that particular direction, and some of it is being led by the kind of more new upcoming agile kind of end of the scale, but also you're seeing some of that investment in the older more traditional institutions. So I think we're kind of dragging everybody in the right direction, and that's what we're seeing. Is the appetite is there? Sometimes there's a challenge, there's a headwind because there's particular budget challenges, etc. At one end, and then at the other end it could be that there's sort of regulatory sort of scrutiny and kind of we think you're moving too fast, so slow down and make sure you've got the fundamentals in place. So there's lots of interesting stuff out there.
It touches on something that I probably want to ask each of you a view on, because we haven't really picked up on so much on the customer pressure here. Customers are demanding. Customers want swift onboarding. They want us to make decisions quickly. They can't wait for a complete due diligence process to complete in the traditional way. You're going to lose that customer. They're going to move on, and that creates a pressure and a tension on any AML compliance environment. So how do we manage those tensions where customers are expecting swift decisions? Linda, do you want to pick up on that first?
Yeah, so I think it comes back to remembering that most people are not trying to launder money through your organisation, and I think it is about having I'm so all about the risk, right? And I think it's about setting those things and trying to surely there's tech there that just help you make a really quick decision initially based on this information I've been presented with. I don't have any issue with them, and then do your other bits afterwards. And then when you do, okay, you have the problem of trying to exit, but there's not, I think it's a proportionate thing, right? Most people, you're not going to want to turn around and exit. I go back to when I bought this house, and I actually just put it on the market again. So I'm going to go through it all again. I'm going to have my identity verified by 2 estate agents, a solicitor, a mortgage company, and like, why do I need to be verified 4 times? So again, I mean, I don't know. There was discussion a while ago around having a digital ID. The government was supposed to be setting it up. I haven't heard much about it lately. There was some like other ideas to sort of look at blockers to getting people access to our financial services. But yeah, I think it is a challenge, but I think we just need to take that step back. And I think the problem is the regulator scared everybody. The regulator has scared us so much that we're like, oh, if we make a mistake, we're going to be in so much trouble. But I think it's just about having the confidence to go, 90% of those people will be fine. Let them through, do the work after.
Yeah, which is in a way a risk-based approach.
Yeah.
Exactly that. So let's go. We're coming up on time now. We had another question. Let's just make sure I've got that question, and just let's pose this one. The question's along the lines that this big challenge is too much data that contradicts each other. And how could we be sure which source is the most correct / up-to-date / reliable? I think we've kind of touched on data governance, but it's a very valid point. You know, that there is a variety of sort of, you know, how much you can depend on different sources of data, and we can have too much. And it's making sure that we have the right data helps us not miss anything that's significant, because that's always the worry when you're in ML compliance, that you miss something. Thoughts?
You can never have too much data. I think it's an interesting one, isn't it? Because, you know, in my career, it's been, you know, there's never been enough to kind of drive some of the analytics or things we want to do. But I think there is, you know, with extra data comes extra responsibilities. I'm sure there's a pithy line in there somewhere, but ultimately it is that kind of resolution, the kind of, you know, being able to resolve entities, be able to kind of create your golden sources and be able to validate data is the kind of mechanisms by which you do that. And I think being bold about what you discard, right? So there's going to be you know, I used to think about it in terms of training. You know, when you go on a course and you're training, and you'd be like, 10% of this is probably what I'll be interested in. The rest of it's just I've got to be there for a couple of hours. The same with the data, is that you kind of want to get your 10% out of it, or whatever is valuable, but not being frustrated that it's, you know, you're not using all of it. And I do think that it's that resolution, it's that kind of resolving of those entities. It's kind of that building a better picture by matching data across multiple sources, and then kind of going, you know, this is the mechanism by which I kind of validate my golden source of data.
Yeah, I think good points, Tom. Very good points.
And I think when we switched our system on, we were inundated with data, and I think it became clear quite quickly that we weren't interested in tweets, Google reviews, complaints about people. So we kind of discard all of that, and then we got to the point where we would look at, you know, known reputable newspapers or newspaper sites. Again, if there's like, you know, a site that we weren't quite sure about, we'd maybe take a look at it. But I think it's about having the balance, because there will always be situations where you'll get 4 articles telling you one thing and 2 telling you something else, and then you've got to work out for yourself, are you comfortable to take a decision off the back of that, or do you need to just keep, there is nothing wrong with keeping a watching brief on situations. We used to do that quite a lot. We'd start finding something and we'd go, okay, we're going to track this and see where it goes, and that's a good thing to do.
Absolutely. Sam, this is something you probably feel very strongly about, because you use an awful lot of data, and some of that does come from unverifiable sources, as you touched on earlier on, you know, but it's important because often the nuggets can be found in those areas.
Yeah, and I was going to say what Linda's kind of finished up with there, which is, I think, the understanding of what sources are, I mean, even to the point of corporate records, court records, regulatory records, those kind of things, what sources are official. So kind of prioritizing those ones. And then with kind of like news sources, understanding which sources are more reputable, which sources are a bit more, maybe a bit more biased, and are likely to report information in a certain way. I mean, even things like social media, yeah, exactly what Linda said at the end, which is picking up on those things and being aware of them is really, really important. doesn't mean you have to necessarily act on every single thing. So understanding that, and then using this ongoing monitoring that we spoke about, where you can say, okay, well, we're going to track this issue that we think is happening. We'll monitor that for a period of time, and there should be some sort of resolution to it.
Thank you, Sam. Well, we're nearly up on the hour. I don't know where the hour's gone, but we got 1 minute left. So a very brief comment from each of you, please, if I may. Top tip, top thought, whatever you would say you'd want to share with the audience in terms of, you know, data management and so forth. And I'll start with you, Tom, if I may. I think you've gone on mute.
Sorry, I had to do it right at the end. You know, it's necessary. You know, I think that we've covered some really great stuff. I think the important thing for me is about, you know, kind of enriching data. You know, making sure that you're using those data sources, you're overlaying that with analytics, and being kind of confident to bring that data to help. You know, drive detection, drive investigation. So I think that's the key areas that I see as a focus area.
Thanks, Tom. Linda?
I think I'm twofold. One is set clear outcomes, like just decide initially upfront what you want the data to do for you. And then the second one is I'm all about the risk. Make sure you keep it, set your risk appetite, what your expectations are, what's acceptable, and then work to that.
Great. Thank you, Linda. Great tip. Sam, last thought from you.
Yeah, just being open to more different data sources and then trying to not discarding them immediately, trying to understand what that information is showing and how relevant and how useful it can be.
Brilliant. Thank you, Sam. Thank you, Linda. Thank you, Tom. Words of wisdom. I hope you've enjoyed it. We're up on time, so it just leaves me to thank the panel, to thank Neotas for hosting and sponsoring this event, and obviously to thank all of you for joining us today. And goodbye.
Thank you.
Bye.